At the wedding, the wealthy in-laws laughed at the bride's poor father. But when the old man took the microphone, everyone fell silent. The afternoon sun filtered through the lace curtains of the Gutierrez's modest living room, illuminating Alejandra's worried face. Her trembling hands held an elegant, expensive wedding invitation that contrasted with the simplicity of her surroundings. On the small, worn sofa, her mother, Elena, watched her with a mixture of pride and fear. "Mija, are you sure about this?" Elena asked, her voice heavy with concern. "The San Clementes aren't like us. You saw how they looked at us last time." Alejandra sighed, remembering the cold reception at the San Clemente mansion. "Mom, Esteban is different. He loves me for who I am," she replied, though a hint of doubt crept into her voice. At that moment, the door creaked open, and Don Roberto, Alejandra's father, entered. His face, weathered by the sun and hard work on the San Clemente ranch, showed lines of exhaustion and worry. "What do the boys' families say?" he asked, leaving his worn hat on the table. "The San Clementes," Alejandra began, but stopped when she saw her father's somber expression. "Dad, what's wrong?" Don Roberto sat down heavily, his eyes avoiding his daughter. "Today at the ranch, Mr. San Clemente called me into his office. He told me that if I allowed this wedding, he would throw me out of work." A tense silence filled the room. Alejandra felt the world crumble around her. The reality of the social differences that separated her family from the San Clementes hit hard. "They can't do that," she whispered, rage and helplessness building inside her. Elena took her husband's hand, her eyes shining with determination. "We will find a solution. We always do." Alejandra looked at the invitation in her hands. The luxurious paper now seemed to mock her dreams. At that moment, she swore that nothing and no one would prevent her happiness, never imagining the whirlwind of events that was about to unfold. The wind blew gently through the cane fields of Hacienda San Clemente, swaying the green leaves under a deep blue sky. Alejandra walked with a determined step along the dirt path, her heart pounding as she remembered the day that changed her life. 6 months ago, while she was tending to a sick horse in the stables, Esteban San Clemente had appeared like a vision. Tall, with green eyes and a captivating smile, the heir to the hacienda had fallen in love with the young veterinarian. He had never seen anyone treat animals with such affection, he told her that day, his eyes shining with admiration. Alejandra, surprised by the rich young man's interest, had felt an instant spark. "It's my passion," she replied with a shy smile. From that moment on, their encounters became frequent. Esteban looked for excuses to visit the stables, and Alejandra found herself anxiously awaiting his visits. One afternoon, as they walked through the cane fields, Esteban took her hand. "Alejandra, I've never met someone like you. So authentic, so passionate." She looked at him, her heart racing. "Esteban, we're from different worlds, your family." He interrupted her with a passionate kiss. "I don't care what they say. I love you, Alejandra." Those words sealed their fate. Despite the warnings of their parents and the disapproving glances of the hacienda workers, their love blossomed. Now, as Alejandra advanced towards the San Clemente mansion to face Esteban's family, those memories gave her strength, but a pang of unease lodged in her stomach. Would their love be strong enough to overcome the barriers that separated them? Arriving at the imposing door of the mansion, Alejandra took a deep breath. What would happen next would change the course of their lives forever. The opulent hall of the San Clemente mansion echoed with heated shouts. Esteban, his face flushed with anger, faced his parents, Ernesto and Victoria San Clemente, who looked at him with a mixture of disbelief and contempt. "It's madness, Esteban," Ernesto bellowed, slamming his fist on the expensive mahogany table. "I will not allow you to ruin this family's legacy by marrying the daughter of a laborer." Victoria, elegantly dressed, intervened in a cold voice. "Think of your future, son. That girl does not belong in our world. What will our friends, our partners say?" Esteban clenched his fists, his voice shaking with rage. "I don't give a damn what they say. I love Alejandra and I am going to marry her, whether they like it or not." "You are an ingrate," Ernesto shouted. "Everything you have, everything you are, you owe to us, and this is how you repay us?" The young heir approached his father, defiant. "All I owe them is a life of impossible expectations and archaic prejudices. Alejandra loves me for who I am, not for the name San Clemente." Victoria let out a bitter laugh. "And do you think that is enough? When the money runs out, when you have to really work, do you think their love will last?" His mother's words hit Esteban like a slap. For a moment doubt flashed in his eyes, but he quickly suppressed it. "If necessary, I will work in the cane fields like Alejandra's father. At least I will be happy and honest." Ernesto, red with fury, pointed to the door. "Get out of my sight. If you insist on this madness, forget about your inheritance, your name, everything." Esteban looked at his parents for the last time, a mixture of pain and determination on her face. "I'd rather lose everything than lose her." With those words, she left the room, leaving behind a silence full of tension. Victoria dropped into an armchair, tears of frustration in her eyes, while Ernesto looked out the window, his mind already plotting how to prevent this wedding at all costs. Alejandra's small apartment vibrated with a mixture of excitement and anxiety. Sitting in front of the mirror, the young woman watched her reflection, while her best friend, Lucia, arranged her hair for a bridal hairstyle test. "You look beautiful, Ale," Lucia smiled, placing the last hairpin. "Esteban is going to faint when he sees you walk down the aisle." Alejandra tried to smile, but her eyes revealed deep concern. "What if I'm making a mistake, Lu? Things with Esteban's family are getting worse." Lucia sat in front of her, taking her hands. "Friend, true love always faces obstacles. You can overcome them." At that moment, Alejandra's phone vibrated. It was a message from her father. "Daughter, I was fired from the ranch." The San Clementes made good on their threat. Alejandra's heart sank. Tears threatened to ruin her freshly applied makeup. "Oh my God, what have I done?" Lucia read the message and hugged her friend. "It's not your fault, Ale. It's them who are wrong." Alejandra stood up, pacing nervously around the room. "Maybe I should call off the wedding. Can't I do this to my family and give up on your happiness? On your future with Esteban?" The bride paused, looking at the white dress hanging in the closet. It was simple, but beautiful, bought with her life savings. It represented her dreams, her hopes. "I don't know if I can be happy knowing that my family is suffering because of my decision," she whispered. Lucia moved closer, placing her hands on Alejandra's shoulders. "Listen to me carefully. You are strong, intelligent, and you deserve to be happy. Don't let the hatred and prejudices of others destroy your love." Alejandra looked at her friend, a spark of determination lighting up in her eyes. "You're right. I'll talk to Esteban. We'll find a solution together." As Alejandra picked up her phone to call her fiancé, she couldn't imagine that this decision would trigger a series of events that would forever change the fate of both families. The wedding day dawned with a leaden gray sky, as if foreshadowing the storm that was about to break. In the modest village church, the guests were beginning to arrive, forming two clearly differentiated groups, the elegant and haughty San Clemente family on one side, and the humble but proud Gutierrez on the other. Alejandra, hidden in a small back room, breathed deeply, trying to calm her nerves. Her white dress, although simple, made her look radiant. Her mother, Elena, adjusted the veil with trembling hands. "You look beautiful, my girl," Elena whispered with tears in her eyes. "No matter what happens today, remember how much we love you." At that moment, Don Roberto entered the room. His face showed a mixture of pride and concern. "It's time, Alejandra." Meanwhile, at the altar, Esteban waited with a mixture of anxiety and determination. He could feel the disapproving glances of his parents from the front row, but he stood his ground. The wedding march began to play, and all eyes turned to the entrance. Alejandra appeared on the arm of her father, slowly advancing down the aisle. The murmurs did not take long to appear. "Look at that simple dress," Victoria San Clemente whispered to her husband. "She can't even afford a decent wedding." Ernesto San Clemente, his face tense, replied through gritted teeth, "This is a farce. I will not allow that opportunist to ruin our son." As Alejandra approached the altar, she could feel the tension in the air. The San Clemente family's contemptuous glances were staring at her like daggers, but she struggled to keep her head high. When she finally reached Esteban, he took her hand tightly, reassuring her. "You're beautiful," he whispered. The priest began the ceremony, but the atmosphere was charged with palpable tension. No one could have imagined that in a matter of minutes, an unexpected turn would change the course of the ceremony and their lives forever. The tension in the church was palpable as the priest continued with the ceremony. Suddenly, the doors swung open, causing all the guests to turn around in shock. In the doorway, panting and with a disfigured face, stood Martín Suárez, the former foreman of Hacienda San Clemente. His bloodshot eyes scanned the church until they settled on Ernesto San Clemente. "Stop this farce," Martín shouted, advancing down the aisle. "This wedding cannot continue." Ernesto jumped up, his face pale as wax. "Get this drunk out of here," he ordered, but his voice was shaking. Alejandra and Esteban looked at each other in confusion, while murmurs filled the church. Don Roberto, recognizing Martín, approached him. "Martín, what is going on?" he asked, trying to calm the man. Martín, with tears in his eyes, pointed accusingly at Ernesto. "That man destroyed my life, and now he intends to ruin his own sons." Victoria San Clemente stood up, her cold voice cutting through the air. "This man is clearly disturbed. Someone get him out of here." But Martín was unfazed. He pulled a crumpled envelope from his jacket. "I have proof. Ernesto San Clemente is not who everyone thinks he is. His hands are stained with blood." A deathly silence fell over the church. Esteban, pale, looked at his father. "Dad, what are you talking about?" Ernesto, sweating profusely, tried to approach Martín. "I don't know what you're talking about. You're crazy." But Martín stepped back, opening the envelope. "Here's the truth about my wife's death. It was an accident," they said, "but I know the truth, and now everyone will know it." Alejandra, feeling the world crumbling around her, looked at Esteban. The young man seemed to be in shock, his gaze alternating between his father and Martín. The priest, visibly disturbed, tried to regain control. "Maybe we should take a break," but it was too late. The bomb had gone off, and the consequences of this revelation were about to change the fate of everyone present irrevocably. Chaos broke out in the church. Guests rose from their seats, some shouting, others whispering frantically. Ernesto San Clemente, his face disfigured, tried to snatch the envelope from Martín's hands. "Give it to me, you damn drunk!" Ernesto roared, wrestling with the former foreman. In the midst of the tumult, Don Roberto stepped between the two men. "Enough! This is a house of God." Alejandra, still in her wedding dress, looked at the scene in horror. "Esteban, what is happening?" But Esteban seemed petrified, his gaze fixed on his father. "Dad, is it true? What is Martín talking about?" Victoria San Clemente, trying to maintain her composure, approached her son. "Honey, don't listen to this man. He's mad with resentment because your father fired him years ago." Martin, with tears in his eyes, screamed, "Lieutenant, I was fired because I discovered the truth. Your husband, Victoria, caused the accident that killed my Maria." A collective gasp went through the church. Alejandra felt herself gasping for air. What had she gotten herself into? Suddenly, Esteban snatched the envelope from Martin's hands and opened it. His eyes quickly scanned the contents and his face paled even more. "My God," he whispered, looking up at his father. "It's true. There are photos, reports." "Dad, how could you?" Ernesto, seeing everything falling apart, screamed desperately. "It was an accident. I didn't want to." She threatened to tell everything. "Tell what?" Esteban asked, his voice shaking with rage. "The dirty business, the false accounts," Martin replied. "Your empire, Ernesto, is built on blood and lies." Alejandra, feeling her legs fail her, leaned on her father. Don Roberto hugged her, looking with a mixture of pity and repulsion at the San Clementes. Victoria, seeing everything falling apart, tried a last resort. "Esteban, son, you can't believe this man over your own family." But Esteban was no longer listening. With the documents in his hand, he headed towards the exit of the church. "Where are you going?" Alejandra shouted, his voice breaking. Esteban stopped at the door, his gaze lost. "I need to think. Everything has been a lie." And with those words, he left the church, leaving behind a sea of confusion, pain, and secrets that had just come to light. The afternoon sun filtered through the church's stained glass windows, illuminating the chaotic scene unfolding inside. The guests, divided between shock and outrage, stood in groups murmuring heatedly. Alejandra, still in her wedding dress, sat on a pew in the front row, her face hidden in her hands. Elena, her mother, hugged her silently, unable to find words of comfort in the face of such a mess. Don Roberto approached them, his face somber. "Daughter, I think it's best that we go. This isn't a wedding anymore." Alejandra looked up, her eyes red from crying. "How could this happen, Dad? How could I be so blind?" At the other end of the church, Ernesto San Clemente was arguing heatedly with his wife Victoria. "We have to find Esteban. We can't let him ruin everything we've worked for." Victoria, with a coldness that chilled the blood, replied, "Worked for? You mean lied to, robbed, and murdered? How could you, Ernesto? How could you put us in this situation?" Martin, the former foreman, watched the scene with a mixture of satisfaction and pain. Years of silence and guilt had finally exploded, but the price had been high. He approached Alejandra, his voice filled with remorse. "I'm sorry, girl. I didn't want to ruin your day, but..." The truth had to come out. Alejandra looked at him, unable to hold any grudge. "It's not your fault, Martin. Lies and crime. Those are the real culprits." Suddenly, the church doors swung open. Esteban entered, his wedding suit disheveled and his face marked by fierce determination. "I called the police," he announced, his voice echoing in the sudden silence. "It's all over, Dad. It's time to face the truth." Ernesto, pale as a ghost, tried to approach his son. "Esteban, please, we can fix this. We're family." But Esteban pushed him away with a sharp gesture. "Family? Family isn't built on lies and death." He turned to Alejandra, his eyes filled with pain and regret. "I'm sorry, Ale. I never wanted you to get caught up in this. You deserve better." Someone better. Outside, police sirens began to be heard, rapidly approaching. The truth, long hidden, was about to come fully to light, forever changing the fate of all present. Alejandra's father, Don Roberto. He watched as the police handcuffed Ernesto Sanclemente and escorted him out of the church. The murmur of the guests had turned into a deathly silence, broken only by the muffled sobs of Victoria Sanclemente. With a firm step, Don Roberto approached the altar. His eyes, charged with a mixture of pain and determination, scanned those present. He took the microphone that the priest had abandoned, and with a clear and powerful voice, he began to speak. "Today we came to celebrate love, but we found the naked truth," he said, his voice echoing in the church. "For years I worked in the fields of the San Clementes, enduring humiliation, believing that it was my place in the world." Alejandra looked up, surprised by the strength in her father's voice. Esteban, standing near the door, listened attentively, his face a mask of contradictory emotions. "But today," continued Don Roberto, "I realize that true wealth is not in money or power. It is in honesty, in hard work, in sincere love." Victoria Sanclemente tried to interrupt, but the withering gaze of the other guests made her back off. "You," said Don Roberto, pointing to the Sanclementes, "thought you could play with our lives, that we were less for having less, but you were wrong." Alejandra stood up, tears running down her cheeks but her gaze full of pride towards her father. "My daughter," continued Don Roberto, his voice breaking slightly, "is worth more than all the gold you may have. And today, although your heart is broken, you leave here with your head held high, knowing that you come from a humble but honorable family." Esteban took a step forward as if he wanted to say something, but the words seemed to get stuck in his throat. "And you, boy," said Don Roberto, looking directly at Esteban, "I pity you, because you will have to live with the weight of your family's crimes. But remember this, there is always time to redeem yourself, to choose the right path." With these words, Don Roberto left the microphone and walked toward his family. He took Alejandra's hand and gestured for his wife to follow him. As the Gutierrez family left the church, heads held high, they left behind not only a failed wedding, but a world of lies and prejudices. The silence that remained in the church was deafening. Full of uncomfortable truths and uncertain futures, the sun was setting over the town, dyeing the sky reddish and orange tones, as if nature were reflecting the drama that had just unfolded. In the modest Gutierrez house, Alejandra, still in her wrinkled wedding dress, sat on the small sofa in the living room, her gaze lost in the void. Elena, her mother, came in with a steaming cup of linden tea. "Here, my child. This will calm your nerves." Alejandra took the cup with trembling hands, but did not drink. "Mom, how could I be so blind? How could I not see the truth about the San Clementes?" Don Roberto, who was standing by the window, turned to his daughter. "Love sometimes blinds us, Alejandra. But the important thing is that the truth came to light before it was too late." Suddenly, a knock on the door startled everyone. Elena went to open it, coming face to face with Esteban. "Please," the young man begged, his voice breaking. "I need to talk to Alejandra." Don Roberto stepped in. "I think you've done enough damage, boy." But Alejandra stood up. "It's okay, Dad. I need to hear what you have to say." Esteban came in, his disheveled appearance contrasting with the elegance that had always characterized him. His red eyes fixed on Alejandra. "I didn't know anything about this." I swear her voice trembled. "Everything I felt for you, everything we lived, was real." Alejandra looked at him, a mix of pain and compassion in her eyes. "Maybe you didn't know it, Esteban, but you lived in a bubble of privileges built on the suffering of others." Esteban fell to his knees, tears running down his cheeks. "Forgive me, please. Let me show you that I can be better, that I can change." Don Roberto and Elena watched the scene in silence, aware that this moment would define their daughter's future. Alejandra approached Esteban, her voice firm but compassionate. I can't forgive you now, Esteban. I need time. We need time. If you really want to change, show it with actions, not words." With a last look full of emotion, Alejandra went to her room, closing the door behind her. Esteban stood there, defeated, while Don Roberto helped him up and led him to the exit. Night was falling over the town, taking with it the last vestiges of a day that had forever changed the fate of two families. The truth had come to light, but the consequences were just beginning to be seen. A week after the failed wedding, the town was buzzing with rumors and speculation. In the small veterinary clinic where Alejandra worked, the silence was heavy. Her colleagues looked at her out of the corner of their eyes, not daring to mention what had happened. Alejandra, with dark circles under her eyes and a pale face, was tending to a sick puppy when the door swung open. It was Lucia, her best friend, with a newspaper in her hand and a disfigured face. "Ale, you have to see this," said Lucia, holding out the newspaper. On the front page, a headline screamed in large letters: "San Clemente Empire falls apart. Tax fraud and connections to drug trafficking come to light." Alejandra felt herself running out of air. Her hand shook as she picked up the paper and quickly read the article. The accusations against Ernesto San Clemente had multiplied. Money laundering, tax evasion, and even links to drug cartels. "My God," Alejandra whispered, "how could I have been so blind?" At that moment, her phone vibrated. It was a message from Esteban. "I need to see you." "Please." Lucia looked at the phone and then at her friend. "What are you going to do?" Alejandra hesitated for a moment, but finally answered, "I have to see him. I need answers." That afternoon, in a cafe far from the center of town, Alejandra met Esteban. The young man seemed to have aged years in just a week. His once impeccable clothes were wrinkled, and his unshaven beard gave him an unkempt appearance. "Thank you for coming," Esteban said, his voice barely above a whisper. "Is everything in the paper true?" Alejandra asked bluntly. Esteban nodded slowly. "And there's more, much more. Ale, I'm cooperating with the authorities. I'm going to testify against my father." Alejandra looked at him in surprise. "Do you realize what that means?" "Yes," Esteban replied, his eyes filled with determination. "It means that for the first time in my life, I'm doing the right thing." As they spoke, a group of reporters entered the cafe, cameras in hand. Upon seeing Esteban, they pounced on them. "Mr. San Clemente, is it true that you're going to testify against your father?" "Miss Gutierrez, did you know about the San Clemente's illegal activities?" Amidst the chaos, Alejandra and Esteban looked at each other, aware that their lives would never be the same. The truth had come to light, but the price to pay would be high. The town court had never been so crowded. Journalists, curious people, and relatives of both families were crowded into the courtroom, waiting for the start of the trial against Ernesto San Clemente. Alejandra, sitting in the front row next to her parents, felt her heart pounding in her chest. The judge entered the room, and a deathly silence took over the place. Ernesto San Clemente was led to the stand, handcuffed and with a haggard face. His eyes scanned the room until they stopped at Esteban, who sat on the other side, avoiding his gaze. "The session is open," announced the judge. Ernesto San Clemente is accused of tax fraud, money laundering, and complicity in drug trafficking activities. How do you plead? Ernesto, in a barely audible voice, replied, "Innocent, Your Honor." A murmur ran through the room. The prosecutor stood up, his voice echoing loudly. "Your Honor, the prosecution is calling its first witness, Esteban San Clemente." Alejandra held her breath as she watched Esteban make his way to the stand. The young man was visibly shaking, but his voice was firm as he swore to tell the truth. "Mr. San Clemente," the prosecutor began, "when did you find out about your father's illegal activities?" Esteban took a deep breath before answering. It was gradual. Little things that didn't add up. But the full truth I learned on the day of my failed wedding. And what did he do with that information? At first, nothing. I was in shock, but then I decided I couldn't live with that burden. I decided to cooperate with the authorities. Ernesto San Clemente stood up, shouting, "Traitor! You are the shame of this family." The judge banged his gavel, demanding order. Alejandra watched the scene with a mix of horror and admiration. Esteban, pale but determined, continued his testimony, revealing years of fraud and illicit connections. When the prosecutor finished, the defense attorney approached Esteban. "Mr. San Clemente, isn't it true that you too benefited from your family's wealth for years?" Esteban lowered his gaze. "Yes, it's true, and I'm ashamed of it. But now I'm trying to do the right thing." As the testimony ended, Esteban stepped down from the stand. His eyes met Alejandra's for a brief moment, conveying a mix of pain, regret, and hope. As the trial continued, Alejandra realized that this was just the tip of the iceberg. The truth was coming out, but the consequences would affect everyone for a long time. The tension in the town had reached unbearable levels. 2 weeks after the trial began, Alejandra walked the streets, feeling the stares and murmurs as she passed. Her life had become a whirlwind of mixed emotions and difficult decisions. As she turned a corner, she found herself face to face with Victoria San Clemente. The woman, once elegant and haughty, seemed to have aged years in a matter of days. Her eyes, framed by deep, dark circles, stared at Alejandra with a mixture of resentment and despair. "You, Ciseo Victoria, you and your family have destroyed everything we built." Alejandra, surprised by the encounter, stood firm. "Mrs. San Clemente, your family destroyed itself with your lies and crimes." Victoria took a threatening step towards Alejandra. "Do you think you are better than us? Look at yourself. You are still the daughter of a simple laborer." The words hurt Alejandra, but she was not daunted. "I prefer to be the daughter of an honest man than of a criminal." Suddenly, Victoria broke down, sobbing uncontrollably. "I have lost everything. My husband in jail. My son has turned his back on me. Our reputation destroyed." Alejandra, moved despite herself, did not know how to react. At that moment, Esteban appeared, drawn by the commotion. "Mother," he said in a firm voice, "that's enough." Victoria looked at her son, her eyes full of reproach. "How could you betray us like that, Esteban?" "No, mother," Esteban replied. "The betrayal was living a lie all these years. It's time to face the truth." Alejandra watched the exchange, feeling a pang of compassion for both of them. Esteban turned to her, his eyes searching for some understanding. "Ale, I know it's a lot to ask, but could we talk?" Before Alejandra could respond, a group of reporters appeared, surrounding them with cameras and microphones. "Miss Gutierrez, how does it feel to be the center of this scandal? Mrs. San Clemente, is it true that your husband plans to plead guilty? Esteban, how does this affect your relationship with Alejandra?" In the midst of the chaos, Alejandra felt herself gasping for air. Esteban instinctively took her arm to protect her from the onslaught of questions. Victoria, regaining some of her former composure, faced the reporters with dignity. As the situation spiraled out of control, Alejandra realized that, whether she wanted it or not, her life was irremediably intertwined with that of the San Clementes. The decision she made from now on would not only affect her future, but that of everyone involved in this tragic story. Dusk was falling over the town when Alejandra arrived at the small central plaza. Esteban was already there, sitting on a bench, his gaze lost in the horizon. Seeing her approach, he stood up, nervous. Thank you for coming, Esteban said, his voice heavy with emotion. Alejandra nodded, keeping a certain distance. What did you want to talk about? Esteban took a deep breath before beginning. Ale, I know I've made a lot of mistakes. I lived in a bubble of privilege, blind to the reality of what my family did. But I want you to know that my feelings for you were always real. Alejandra looked at him, her eyes reflecting a mix of pain and confusion. Esteban, how can I believe in anything after everything that's happened? I know, he replied, running a hand through his hair in frustration. But I'm trying to do the right thing now. I'm cooperating with justice. I'm willing to give up everything I obtained illegally. And what do you expect from me? Alejandra asked, her voice barely a whisper. Esteban took a step towards her, but stopped when he saw her cautious expression. I don't expect anything, Ale. I just wanted you to know that, despite everything, my feelings haven't changed. But I understand if you can't trust me anymore. At that moment, Alejandra's phone rang. It was her father. Daughter, come home quickly. They've threatened the family. The color left Alejandra's face. Esteban, noticing her change in expression, asked in alarm, What's wrong? My family. They're in danger, she replied, her voice shaking. Without a second thought, Esteban took her hand. Come on, I'll take you. As they ran toward the Gutierrez house, Alejandra struggled internally. Could she trust Esteban? Was his regret sincere? And more importantly, what dangers now threatened her family for having gotten involved in this turbulent world of the San Clementes? When they arrived at the house, they found Don Roberto and Elena in the living room, visibly upset. On the coffee table, a threatening note warned of the consequences of testifying against the San Clementes. Esteban, upon seeing the note, paled. This must be the work of my father's partners. I can't believe they've gone this far. Alejandra looked at Esteban, then at her parents, aware that the decisions they made from this moment on could change their lives forever. The truth had come out, but the price to pay seemed to be getting higher and higher. The Gutierrez kitchen, once a place of warmth and laughter, now looked like an improvised war room. Don Roberto, his face tense, spoke quietly to a police officer, while Elena made coffee with shaking hands. Alejandra and Esteban stood in a corner, their glances occasionally crossing, heavy with worry and guilt. We can't stay here, Don Roberto finally declared, his voice breaking slightly. Officer Mendoza says it's too dangerous. Elena dropped a cup. The crash of breaking porcelain startled everyone. Leave? But where? This is our home, our life. Alejandra walked over to her mother, hugging her tightly. Mom, it's just temporary. Until this all passes. Esteban, feeling more out of place than ever, stepped forward. This is all my fault, my family, me. I swear I'll do everything I can to protect you. Don Roberto looked at him with a mix of compassion and suspicion. Boy, your intentions may be good now, but the damage is already done. Officer Mendoza stepped in. We have a safe place prepared for you. You must leave tonight, take only the essentials. As the family moved frantically, packing what little they could carry, Alejandra found herself alone with Esteban in the hallway. Ale, Esteban began, but she interrupted him. Don't say anything, Alejandra whispered, her eyes shining with unshed tears. I know you didn't want this to happen, but it is happening. My family is in danger because of your family's secrets. Esteban nodded in defeat. I know, and you don't know how sorry I am, but I promise I won't rest until they're safe, until all the truth comes out and justice is done. For a moment, Alejandra saw in his eyes the man she'd fallen in love with, determined and brave. but the reality of her situation fell on her like a crushing weight. Esteban, I think it's best that we don't see each other for a while. I need to protect my family. And you need to face what comes with yours. Before Esteban could answer, Don Roberto knocked from the door. It's time, Alejandra. With one last look at the house that had been their home all their lives, the Gutierrez family set out toward an uncertain future. Esteban watched them go, aware that the road to redemption would be long and painful, but determined to walk it, no matter the cost. Dawn found Alejandra awake in a small hotel room on the outskirts of the city. It had been 3 days since her family had left their home, and uncertainty hung over them like a dark cloud. With dark circles under her eyes and disheveled hair, Alejandra walked to the window, looking out at the unfamiliar landscape. A soft knock on the door startled her. It was her father, Don Roberto, with a newspaper in his hand and a grim expression. "Daughter, you have to see this," he said, handing her the paper. Alejandra took the paper with trembling hands. On the front page, a striking headline screamed, "San Clemente scandal spreads. Ties to local politicians exposed." "My God," Alejandra whispered, quickly reading the article. "This is bigger than we thought." Don Roberto nodded gravely. "And there's more. I just spoke to Officer Mendoza. It seems Esteban has been investigating on his own, risking his own safety to uncover the truth." Alejandra felt a pang of worry. Despite everything, she couldn't help but feel something for Esteban. Is he okay? Is he safe? "For now," Don Roberto replied. "But Mendoza says he's walking on thin ice. His father's partners aren't happy with his cooperation." Just then, Alejandra's phone vibrated. It was a message from an unknown number. "I need to see you. I have crucial information." Alejandra looked at her father, debating internally. "Dad, it's Esteban. He says he has important information." Don Roberto frowned. "He's dangerous, Alejandra. We don't know if we can trust him completely." "I know," she replied. "But if he has information that can help solve all this, that can keep us safe, I have to take the risk." After a long discussion with her parents and a call to Officer Mendoza, a meeting was arranged in a public place under discreet police surveillance. That afternoon, in a busy shopping center, Alejandra waited nervously. She saw Esteban approach, looking haggard and nervous. "Ale," he said, his voice barely a whisper. "Thanks for coming. What I've discovered changes everything, but it puts us in even greater danger." As Esteban began to reveal what he had discovered, Alejandra felt the world spinning around her. The truth was darker and more dangerous than they had imagined, and they were now at the center of a storm that threatened to sweep everything away in its wake. The bustle of the mall seemed far away, as Alejandra listened with growing horror to Esteban's revelations. They had taken refuge in a secluded corner of the cafeteria, their voices barely audible over the murmur of the people around them. "My father's business wasn't just local," Esteban explained, his voice shaking slightly. "There are connections to international cartels, high-level politicians, even judges. It's a huge network of corruption." Alejandra felt her breath run out. "Esteban, do you realize what you're saying? This is too big." He nodded gravely. "I know, and there's more. I found documents that suggest that the death of Martin's husband, the former foreman, was not an accident. My father ordered his murder." A shiver ran down Alejandra's spine. "My God, what are we going to do with all this information?" "I've already contacted a federal prosecutor," Esteban replied. "But I need your help, Ale. There's evidence hidden in the old hacienda, in a place that only you and I know." Alejandra immediately remembered the old barn where they used to meet in secret during their courtship. The nostalgia of those happy times contrasted brutally with the current reality. "It's dangerous, Esteban. If they discover us, I know it." He interrupted her, taking her hand by instinct. "But it's our only chance to end all this once and for all." At that moment, Alejandra noticed something strange. A man with dark glasses was staring at them from another table. Her heart began to pound. "Esteban," she whispered, "I think they're watching us." The young man visibly tensed. "We have to get out of here. Now." They stood up trying to stay calm, but as they reached the mall exit, they saw two menacing-looking men blocking the way. "This way," Esteban said, leading Alejandra toward an emergency exit. They ran down a service hallway, the sound of heavy footsteps behind them. As they emerged into a back alley, they came face to face with Officer Mendoza. "Quickly to the car!" the cop shouted. As they sped away, Alejandra looked at Esteban, fear and adrenaline coursing through her veins. "What do we do now?" she asked, her voice barely a whisper. Esteban, with a determination Alejandra hadn't seen before, answered, "Let's go to the hacienda. It's time to end this once and for all." The car was lost in the night, leading them toward an uncertain and dangerous destination, but also toward the possibility of truth and justice. The night enveloped the old San Clemente hacienda in a blanket of eerie darkness. Officer Mendoza parked the car a safe distance away, turning off the lights. Alejandra and Esteban exchanged tense glances before quietly exiting the vehicle. "Be careful," Mendoza whispered. "I'll be watching, but I can't get any closer without raising suspicion." Alejandra felt the weight of the situation pressing down on her chest as they made their way through the shadows toward the old barn. Every creak, every whisper of the wind seemed like an imminent threat. "It's here," Esteban murmured, stopping in front of the rickety wooden structure. With shaking hands, Alejandra helped Esteban move a heavy box, revealing a hidden trap door. The smell of dampness and old secrets hit them as they opened it. "My God," Alejandra gasped as she saw the amount of documents and electronic devices stored there. Esteban began frantically rummaging through the papers. "It has to be here, the main ledger." Suddenly, a noise startled him, footsteps approaching. "Someone's coming," Alejandra whispered, panic rising in her voice. Esteban grabbed a handful of documents and a USB drive. "We have to go now." But it was too late. The barn door swung open, revealing the imposing figure of Ernesto San Clemente, flanked by two armed men. My, Ernesto said, his voice dripping with contempt. "My own son, the traitor, and his little country girl girlfriend. How touching!" Alejandra froze. "But you should be in jail." Ernesto let out a bitter laugh. "Do you think simple bars can stop me? I have friends in high places, my dear." Esteban stepped in front of Alejandra Protector. "It's over, Dad. We have the evidence. Everything will come out." "Oh, my son," Ernesto replied, pulling out a gun. "How naive you are. No one will leave here with that evidence." Time seemed to stand still. Alejandra saw Ernesto's finger tighten on the trigger. She heard Esteban's piercing scream. And then a shot rang out in the night. But it didn't come from Ernesto's gun. Patriarch San Clemente fell to the ground, startled. Behind him, Victoria San Clemente held a smoking gun, her face a mask of pain and determination. "Enough, Ernesto," Victoria said, her voice cracking. "It's over." The bodyguards, confused, lowered their weapons. At that moment, Officer Mendoza and a team of police officers burst into the barn. As Ernesto and the others were handcuffed, Alejandra and Esteban looked at each other, stunned by the turn of events. The truth had finally come to light, but the cost had been high, very high. Dawn found Alejandra sitting in the interrogation room at the local police station, her tired eyes fixed on the untouched glass of water in front of her. The last few hours had been a whirlwind of statements, paperwork, and emotional shock. The door opened, and the federal prosecutor entered, a middle-aged man with a piercing gaze. "Miss Gutierrez, thank you for your patience. I know it's been a rough night." Alejandra nodded weakly. "How is Esteban? And Mrs. Victoria?" The prosecutor sat down across from her. "Esteban is fine, physically at least. Mrs. San Clemente is in custody, but considering the circumstances, he will likely be treated with some leniency." "And Mr. Ernesto?" Alejandra asked, almost fearing the answer. "In the hospital, under surveillance. He will survive to face justice," the prosecutor replied, his tone grave. "But that's not what I want to talk to you about. The evidence you and Esteban recovered is explosive, to say the least." Alejandra sat up, suddenly alert. "What do you mean?" The prosecutor pulled out a thick folder. "Politicians, judges, businessmen. Corruption is reaching levels we never imagined. And I'm afraid this puts you and your family in a very delicate position." Alejandra's heart raced. "What do you mean? Are we in danger?" "Always have been," the prosecutor answered frankly. "But now we need your testimony, Miss Gutierrez, and that of your family. You are key pieces to dismantle this entire network." Alejandra felt the weight of the world fall on her shoulders. "But what will happen to us? Our lives?" The prosecutor looked her straight in the eyes. "I'll be honest with you. You'll have to enter the witness protection program. New identities, new life, far from here." The words fell like a stone. Alejandra thought of her parents, her home, everything she would have to leave behind, and of Esteban. What would happen to him? "Do I have a choice?" she asked, although she already knew the answer. The prosecutor shook his head. "I'm afraid not, if you want to be sure. But think of the greater good, Miss Gutierrez. With your help, we can clean up not just this town, but unmask a corruption that affects the entire country." Alejandra closed her eyes, feeling the weight of the decision weighing on her. When she opened them, there was a new determination in her gaze. "When do we start?" she asked, her voice barely a whisper but heavy with resolve. The prosecutor nodded approvingly. "Right now. And Alejandra, thank you. I know it's not easy, but you're doing the right thing." As the prosecutor began to explain the next steps, Alejandra looked out the window, watching the sun rise over her town. A new day was beginning, and with it, a new life she'd never imagined. The afternoon sun filtered through the blinds of the small safe house on the outskirts of town. Alejandra sat on a worn couch watching her parents talk quietly in the kitchen. 2 weeks had passed since that fateful night at the San Clemente ranch, and the world they knew had completely fallen apart. A soft knock on the door startled everyone. Agent Martinez, in charge of her protection, entered with a serious expression. "We have news," he announced, addressing the Gutierrez family. "The trial against Ernesto San Clemente and his accomplices will begin next week. And there is a complication." Alejandra tensed. "What kind of complication?" Martinez sighed heavily. "Esteban San Clemente has requested to speak with you before the trial, especially with you, Alejandra." Don Roberto approached, protective. "Is it safe? Won't it compromise our situation?" "We have taken all the necessary precautions," Martinez replied. "But the decision is yours." Alejandra felt her heart race. Seeing Esteban meant facing emotions she had tried to bury during these weeks of isolation. "What will happen to him after the trial?" she asked. Her voice was barely a whisper. Martinez looked at her with compassion. Given her cooperation, she will likely receive a reduced sentence. But she will also have to enter the protection program. Her life, like yours, will never be the same. Elena, Alejandra's mother, approached her daughter and hugged her. "My child, what do you want to do?" Alejandra closed her eyes, remembering the moments she had lived with Esteban, the promises, the dreams, and also the lies and the pain. "I need to see him," she finally said, opening her eyes with determination. "I need to close this chapter before we begin our new life." Don Roberto nodded, resigned. "If that's what you need, daughter, we will support you." Martinez made a quick call and then turned to Alejandra. "It's done. You'll see him tomorrow, in a neutral and safe place." That night, as the family prepared for bed, Alejandra lay awake, staring out the window. The encounter with Esteban represented more than just a conversation. It was the bridge between her past and her uncertain future. What would she say? How could she say goodbye to the man she had loved, and who, unwittingly, had changed the course of their lives forever? With a sigh, Alejandra walked away from the window. Tomorrow she would face Esteban, and with him, all the ghosts of the past that still haunted her. The place chosen for the meeting was an abandoned cafe on the outskirts of the city. Alejandra entered, escorted by Agent Martinez, her heart pounding. The place was empty, save for a solitary figure sitting at a table in the back. Esteban stood up when he saw her, his face a mix of emotions, relief, guilt, and a glimmer of hope. "Ale," he whispered, taking a step towards her. Alejandra stopped, keeping her distance. "Hello, Esteban," she said, her voice shaking. They sat down, the silence heavy between them. Finally, Esteban spoke. "Thank you for coming. I know I have no right to ask you for anything, but I needed to see you one last time." Alejandra looked at him, noticing the deep circles under his eyes and the weight he seemed to carry on his shoulders. "Why, Esteban? Why did you want to see me?" Esteban took a deep breath. "To ask for your forgiveness, for everything, for dragging you and your family into this hell, for not being brave enough to face the truth sooner." "Esteban, No, let me finish." He interrupted her softly. "I want you to know that, despite everything, what we had was real. Every moment, every promise. I loved you, Alejandra. I love you still." Tears began to run down Alejandra's cheeks. "I loved you too, Esteban. But now everything has changed. Our lives no longer belong to us." Esteban nodded, defeated. "I know. And that's why I wanted to see you. To tell you that I release you, Ale, from any promise, any commitment. You deserve to be happy, to have a full life, without the shadows of my family." Alejandra looked at him, surprised by his words. "And you? What will happen to you?" "I will serve my sentence, whatever it may be. And then, I will try to rebuild my life, far from all this. Do something good, something that compensates even a little for all the damage caused." They looked at each other in silence, years of love, dreams, and now pain, reflected in their eyes. Alejandra, on impulse, took Esteban's hand. "Thank you," she said softly, "for the truth, for your bravery in the end, and I hope you find peace, Esteban." Esteban squeezed her hand, tears in his eyes. "And I hope you find the happiness you deserve, Ale. You will always be in my heart." Agent Martinez approached, indicating that it was time to leave. Alejandra stood up, slowly letting go of Esteban's hand. "Goodbye, Esteban," she said, her voice barely a whisper. "Goodbye, Ale," he replied, watching her walk away. As Alejandra left the cafeteria, she felt as if a chapter in her life was closing for good. The future was uncertain, but for the first time in weeks, she felt a glimmer of hope. The truth had torn them apart, but it had also set them free. The day of the trial dawned gray and gloomy, as if the sky itself reflected the gravity of the events about to unfold. The courtroom was surrounded by journalists and curious onlookers, all eager to witness the outcome of the scandal that had shaken the foundations of the community. Alejandra and her family were escorted through a side door, avoiding the tumult. From a private room, they would watch the proceedings via closed-circuit television, an added security measure given the magnitude of the case. The judge, a stern-looking man, entered the courtroom. The session opens in the state's case against Ernesto Sanclemente and associates. He announced in a firm voice. Ernesto Sanclemente, once powerful and arrogant, now looked gaunt and aged in the dock. At her side, several of her partners and accomplices, including local politicians and businessmen, waited with obvious nervousness. The prosecutor stood up, his voice echoing in the room. Your Honor, the state will present irrefutable evidence of a network of corruption, money laundering, and organized crime that extends beyond the boundaries of our community. As the prosecutor outlined the charges, Alejandra watched the screen, her heart pounding. She saw Esteban sitting in the witness box, his face pale but determined. "Are you okay, daughter?" Don Roberto asked, noticing Alejandra's tension. She nodded weakly. It's hard to watch all of this, knowing that we were part of it without knowing it." Elena took her daughter's hand. "No, my love. We were not part of this. We were victims, but we are also part of the solution." The trial progressed, witness after witness, uncovering a web of corruption that left everyone stunned. When Esteban's turn came, Alejandra held her breath. "Mr. Sanclemente," the prosecutor began, "can you tell us when you realized the true nature of your father's business?" Esteban's voice was clear but laden with emotion. "It was a gradual process. Little things that didn't add up, half-baked conversations. But I learned the full truth on the day of my failed wedding." As Esteban detailed the crimes of her father and his associates, Alejandra couldn't help but feel a mix of pride and pain. Pride for her courage in facing the truth. Pain for all that was lost in the process. At the end of the day, the judge announced that the verdict would be announced in a week. As the Gutierrez family was escorted back to the safe house, Alejandra reflected on how their lives had irrevocably changed. The truth had come to light, but the cost had been high. Now, all that was left to do was wait and prepare for a future that was uncertain, but free from the shadows of the past. A week into the trial, the Gutierrez family was gathered in the small living room of the safe house. The tension was palpable as they waited for the call that would inform them of the verdict. Alejandra sat by the window, watching the rain fall softly, a perfect reflection of her turbulent emotions. The phone rang, startling everyone. Agent Martinez, who had been with them through this entire process, quickly answered. "I understand. Yes. Thank you," he said, his voice neutral. He hung up and turned to the family, his expression serious, but with a hint of relief. "The verdict has been announced," he began. "Ernesto Sanclemente and most of his associates have been found guilty of all charges." A collective sigh filled the room. Elena crossed herself, murmuring a prayer of thanks. Don Roberto, with tears in his eyes, hugged his wife. "And the sentences?" Alejandra asked, her voice barely a whisper. Martinez continued. "Ernesto Sanclemente has been sentenced to 30 years in prison. His main accomplices received similar sentences." As for Esteban, Alejandra held her breath. Given his cooperation and role in exposing the corruption network, he received a reduced sentence of 5 years, with the possibility of parole in 3. Alejandra closed her eyes, a mix of relief and pain washing over her. 5 years. It was a long time, but at least Esteban would have a chance to rebuild his life. "What happens to us now?" Don Roberto asked, voicing the concern they all shared. Martinez sat down, his tone becoming softer. "Now the hardest part begins. The witness protection program is ready to relocate them. New identities, new home, new life. Elena sobbed softly. Will we never be able to go back? Not in the foreseeable future, Martinez answered honestly. The network they've helped dismantle is extensive, and there are still powerful people who might seek revenge. Alejandra walked over to her parents, hugging them. We will get through this together, she said, finding a strength she didn't know she had. We've done the right thing, and now we have the chance to start over. Martinez nodded approvingly. You have 24 hours to prepare. This time tomorrow you will begin your new life. As the family began to process the news and prepare for the great change that awaited them, Alejandra allowed herself a moment of reflection. The truth had come to light, justice had prevailed, but the cost had been high. Yet amid the uncertainty, she felt a glimmer of hope. It was the end of one life, but also the beginning of another. A life free of secrets and lies. A life they could build with honesty and love. Dawn found the Gutierrez family at a small private airport, their few belongings packed into a few suitcases. Alejandra, her hair dyed a dark brown and contact lenses that changed the color of her eyes, sat in a spot of life. She barely recognized herself in the reflection in the window. Ready? Agent Martinez asked, approaching with a manila envelope in his hand. Don Roberto nodded solemnly. While Helena wiped away a furtive tear, Alejandra took a deep breath, trying to calm the nerves that threatened to overwhelm her. Martinez handed them the envelope. Here are your new identities, documents, and the information about your new home. You will memorize everything, and then we will destroy these papers. Alejandra opened the envelope with trembling hands. Morales family, she read quietly. Carmen Morales, her new name, sounded strange on her lips. As they went over the details of their new lives, a small plane landed on the runway. Martinez hurried them toward the exit. It's time, he said with a mixture of professionalism and compassion. Suddenly, a car sped up. Martinez tensed, reaching for his gun, but relaxed when he recognized the driver. It was the federal prosecutor. He hurriedly got out of the car and headed toward them. I got there on time, he said, panting slightly. I wanted to thank you personally. His bravery has allowed us to dismantle one of the largest corruption networks in the country. He turned to Alejandra. And this is for you, he said, handing her a sealed envelope. From Esteban, it passed all the security checks. Alejandra took the envelope, her heart pounding. The prosecutor continued. I can't tell you where he'll go when he serves his sentence, but I wanted you to know that he'll be okay. Thank you, Alejandra murmured, clutching the envelope to her chest. With a final handshake and words of thanks, the family headed toward the plane. Already on the steps, Alejandra stopped and looked back, taking one last look at the place that had been her home. The plane took off, carrying them toward an uncertain future, but full of possibilities. In the air, Alejandra finally opened Esteban's envelope. Inside was a short note. Ale, thank you for teaching me the true meaning of integrity and love. Wherever you are, I hope you find the happiness you deserve. Maybe, in another life, in another time, our paths will cross again. Always yours, Esteban. A tear rolled down Alejandra's cheek as the plane rose above the clouds, carrying her toward a new chapter in her life, one filled with hope and the promise of a new beginning. 5 years later, in a small coastal town thousands of miles from her old life, Carmen Morales, formerly known as Alejandra Gutierrez, walked along the beach at dusk. Her hair, now a reddish hue, fluttered in the sea breeze. The last rays of the sun bathed the ocean in shades of gold and purple, creating a spectacle that still, after all this time, took her breath away. Carmen paused, letting the waves caress her bare feet. She closed her eyes, allowing herself a moment of reflection. 5 years had passed since that day at the airport, since they had left behind not only their home, but also their identities. The transition had not been easy. There were nights of silent tears, days of overwhelming longing, and times when the weight of secrets seemed unbearable. But little by little, the Morales family had built a new life. Don Roberto, now Javier Morales, had found peace working as a gardener at a small local nursery. Elena, renamed Maria, had become a beloved volunteer at the community center. And Carmen had discovered a passion for photography, capturing the beauty of her new home, and in the process, healing her wounded heart. A cheerful bark interrupted her thoughts. Carmen turned to see Max, the Labrador she had adopted a year ago, running toward her. Behind him, a familiar figure was approaching. "Carmen," Daniel called, her neighbor and close friend. "I thought I would find you here." Carmen smiled, feeling the now familiar flutter in her stomach. Daniel had been an unexpected light in her new life, a friend who had become something more without her realizing it. "Hi, Daniel," she replied, petting Max. "I just needed a moment to think." Daniel looked at her with understanding. Though he didn't know the details of her past, he had learned to read the moments when Carmen was lost in her memories. "Are you okay?" he asked softly. Carmen nodded, surprised to realize that for the first time in a long time, she really was. "Yes," her voice said thick with emotion. "I think I finally am." Daniel gently took her hand. "I'm glad. Do you want to walk a little further?" As they walked along the shore, Max scampering ahead of them, Carmen reflected on the road they had traveled. The pain and losses would never completely go away, but they had given way to a new appreciation for life, for second chances. The sun finally sank below the horizon, marking the end of a day and the beginning of a night filled with possibilities. Carmen looked at Daniel, then out at the endless ocean, and for the first time in years, she allowed herself to dream of a bright future, free from the shadows of the past. The morning sun filtered through the curtains of the small house facing the sea, which Carmen now called home. She woke slowly, the sound of the waves, a comforting constant in her new life. Today was a special day, one she had dreaded and longed for in equal parts. Carmen got up and went to the closet. At the bottom, carefully stored, was a box she had not opened in years. She pulled it out with shaking hands and carried it to the kitchen table. As she made coffee, her mind wandered. It had been exactly 10 years since they had left their old life behind. 10 years since the trial that changed everything. 10 years of secrets, of glances over the shoulder, of learning to live again. With the coffee cup in her hand, Carmen finally opened the box. Inside, carefully preserved, were the memories of a past life. Pictures of her family, of her old home, newspaper clippings about the trial, and at the bottom Esteban's letter. Carmen took it feeling the weight of words unread in years. She opened it carefully and began to read, allowing herself for the first time in a long time to fully remember who she once was. As she read, silent tears rolled down her cheeks. They weren't tears of pain or regret, but of acceptance and, surprisingly, gratitude. A soft knock on the door brought her out of her thoughts. It was Daniel, with a warm smile and a bouquet of wildflowers. "Good morning," he said, immediately noticing Carmen's wet eyes. "Are you okay?" Carmen nodded, inviting him in. "Yeah, just remembering." Daniel looked at the open box on the table, understanding. He sat down beside her, silently taking her hand, offering wordless support. "You know," Carmen began after a moment, "for a long time I thought the truth had destroyed us, ruined our lives. Daniel listened intently, as he always did when Carmen shared bits of her past. "But I realize now," she continued, her voice gaining strength, "that the truth also set us free. It gave us a chance to start over, to be who we truly wanted to be." She stood up and walked over to the window, looking out at the ocean. Daniel followed, hugging her from behind. "The truth has a cost," Carmen said, leaning back against him. "But the price of living a lie is much higher." She turned to look at Daniel, her eyes filled with a new determination. "I think I'm ready to tell you everything. About who I was, about what happened." Daniel kissed her softly on the forehead. "I'm here to listen when you're ready." As the sun rose in the sky, bathing the room in golden light, Carmen began to tell her story, not as a victim, not as someone trapped in the past, but as a survivor, as someone who had found the strength to forge a new path. And as she spoke, Carmen realized that this was true redemption. Not forgetting the past, but learning from it. Not denying who she was, but embracing who she had become. The truth, for all its power to destroy, also had the power to heal, to liberate. And in that moment, sharing her story with the man she loved, Carmen felt truly free for the first time in years. The past would always be a part of her, but it no longer defined her. The future, with all its possibilities, awaited her. And this time, she was ready to face it with honesty, courage, and hope. If you enjoyed this story, we'd love for you to support us by liking and subscribing to our Unfolded Stories channel. We would also love to read your comments. It is very gratifying for us to make our followers have a good time. Thank you very much for the unconditional support you show us in each story. Blessings.